group had problems long before. I don't really remember anything about the Beatle days. It seems like a sort of previous incarnation.
He was the quiet Beatle, but he was hurting the most inside. He felt a lot without saying much. What made George feel so left out? And who made him so upset that he couldn't take it anymore?
Beatles was such a big deal. They can't understand why we should actually enjoy splitting up. It's really time for a change.
While John and Paul were busy being stars, George stayed in the background. He smiled on the outside, but inside he was sad and angry, and nobody really noticed how he felt until now. So, who did he feel upset with? Was it Paul, the manager, or someone even closer to him? What did George say that shocked everyone? The answers are more shocking than you think. Let's get right into it. George stood in the shadows with ideas no one cared to hear. He had talent, but in the Beatles, that wasn't always enough. When the Beatles started, most of the attention went to John and Paul. They wrote the songs, made the choices, and got all the praise. George was just the guy with the guitar. Even when he wrote great songs, they were often left out. These actions made him feel small, like he didn't matter. Still, George kept going. He never minded how he was treated, but deep down, he felt sad and alone. He didn't want to be just the extra Beatle. He wanted to be seen and heard, just like the others. The world saw 4 smiling Beatles, but George was struggling. However, before we dive into the fights and heartbreaks that led to his hatred for one of his bandmates, let's stay in the early days when things were beautiful and everyone couldn't get enough of them. Who was George before the world knew his name? Just a boy who loved guitars more than anything. George Harisson was born on February 25, 1943. In a tiny house at 12 Arnold Grove in Liverpool. The house was cold, had stone floors, no indoor bathroom, and only one coal fire for heat. Life was simple, but full of love. And George spent his first 4 years in the house before they moved. He was the youngest of 4 children. He had 3 siblings, his elder sister Louise, and 2 elder brothers, Harold and Peter, who were always rich in spirit, even though the family didn't have much. His dad, Harold Hargreaves Harisson, once worked as a ship steward with the White Star Line before becoming a bus conductor, while his mom, Louise, worked in a shop as an assistant. She loved music and sang loudly around the house. Her strong voice and songs brought joy to their small family home. When George was still in his mom's belly, Louise believed music could help him grow calm and happy. She listened to Radio India with its soft, swirling sitar and drum sounds, hoping the music would soothe her baby. She always supported George's love for music and never stopped him from chasing it. Harisson biographer Joshua Green wrote, "Every Sunday she tuned in to mystical sounds evoked by sitars and tablas, hoping that the exotic music would bring peace and calm to the baby in the womb." In 1949, when George was 5, the family moved to a bigger house, and he started at Dovedale Primary School, and later passed the test to attend the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys from 1954 to 1959. But even with music classes, George felt bored. He wanted real music, not just the rules and theories in school. George didn't learn music from school. He learned it from the world around him. As a kid in the 1950s, he loved funny ukulele songs by George Formby, smooth jazz from Cab Calloway and Django Reinhardt, and sweet tunes by Hoagy Carmichael. Then one day in 1956, everything changed. Riding his bike, George heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel coming from a house window. That sound hit him like magic. From then on, he was all about music. He drew guitars in his school books and dreamed of playing like Slim Whitman, the first singer who made guitar stardom feel real to him. George's dream of playing music started to come true when he was about 14 years old. A friend named Raymond Hughes was selling a guitar, and George wanted it badly. His mother, Louise, managed to find the £3 and 10 shillings needed to buy it. That's about £110 today. It wasn't a fancy guitar, but it meant everything to George. A family friend taught him simple old songs that helped George learn the basics. Once he started playing, he never stopped. George was also swept up in the skiffle music craze, a homemade style that was big in Britain at the time. George formed his first band, the Rebels, with his brother Peter and schoolmate Arthur Kelly. Their music was rough but full of heart, and it gave George his first taste of performing. Then, something special happened on the bus to school. George met Paul McCartney. Paul was older and more skilled, but the two quickly became friends. They both loved American rock music and guitars. The friendship, born on a bus ride, grew into something massive and a partnership that helped shape music forever. How can someone be so loved, yet feel so invisible? And while fans screamed for John and Paul, did anyone even notice George was slipping away? Let's dive deeper to find out. The early career rush, when the Beatles took over the world. George Harrison didn't become famous right away. When he was 15, his friend Paul McCartney took him to meet John Lennon, who had a band called the Quarrymen. But John didn't think George was ready. He said George was too young and didn't have enough experience. Paul didn't give up. He believed George was really good, so he gave him another chance. They were on a double-decker bus when George played a song called Raunchy on his guitar. John listened and was surprised. George played so well that John changed his mind. After that, George became part of the band. Even as a teenager, George knew deep down that music was what he truly loved. His parents wanted him to get a safe job, so after leaving school at 16, he tried working as an electrician's helper. But holding a guitar felt better than holding tools. Shortly after, he was traveling around Scotland with the band. On stage, he called himself Carl Harisson, as a fun nod to his music hero, Carl Perkins. The shows weren't fancy, just small-town gigs with hardly any money, but they were full of energy and love for music. Then, in the 1960s, something big happened. The band took a huge chance and went to Hamburg, Germany. They played long nights in dark, smoky clubs like the Indra and Kaiser Keller. They didn't sleep much and lived in tough conditions, but it made them stronger as a band. Sadly, George's age became a problem. He was still under 18, and the German police found out. They made him leave and return to England. Still, that small setback didn't stop him or the band. They had found their rhythm, and there was no turning back. Back in Liverpool, things started to change. A smart young man named Brian Epstein, who owned a record store, saw something special in the band. He became their manager and helped clean up their look and find bigger chances. Brian got them a record deal with EMI. In 1962, their first song, Love Me Do, hit the charts. A year later, their album Please Please Me made them superstars. While John and Paul were often in the spotlight, George stayed quiet. He got sick with a high fever before their first U.S. trip in 1964 and didn't talk much to reporters. The silence around reporters earned him a new nickname, the Quiet Beatle. The media ran with it. He thought it was silly, but it stuck. Even though he wasn't loud, George's music spoke for him. He sang a few songs early on, and by their second album, With the Beatles, he wrote his first song, Don't Bother Me. It showed his deep, thoughtful style. George loved learning new sounds. While the rest of the band still focused on rock and roll, George explored soul, folk, and Indian music. He bought records by lesser-known American artists and brought fresh ideas to the Beatles. In 1965, their album Rubber Soul showed a big change in style, and George had much to do with it. That same year, he played a new instrument called the sitar on Norwegian wood. Many people in the West had never heard it before. By 1966, George had grown more confident. On Revolver, he wrote Taxman, which made fun of high taxes. Then he made Love You Too, a song filled with Indian sounds. George wasn't just trying something new. He was serious. He also wrote I Want to Tell You, which showed his growing interest in deep thinking and the spirit. Even in John's strange song Tomorrow Never Knows, George added a dreamy Indian sound using the tambura. By 1967, George's song Within You Without You on Sgt. Pepper was more than music. It was about life, spirit, and peace. He helped Western fans hear and feel Indian music in a true, respectful way. George built a musical bridge between two worlds. Even though Sgt. Pepper was a big hit, George had mixed feelings about it. He said it made everything feel more pressured afterward. Still, his spiritual song Within You Without You stood out. By then, George wasn't just the quiet one. He was the deep thinker of the group. In 1968, George went to India to record The Inner Light. It was the first Beatles song with only a spiritual message, inspired by Eastern teachings. While recording the White Album, the band started falling apart. But George kept growing. He wrote the sad and powerful While My Guitar Gently Weeps, with help from his friend Eric Clapton. He also wrote the fun, funky Savoy Truffle. Later, George visited Bob Dylan and the band in America. Their peaceful way of making music felt good to him. Very different from the stress with the Beatles. Back home, George still felt left out. In January 1969, the Beatles tried filming Let It Be at Twickenham Studios, hoping to reconnect. But tensions ran high and George grew tired of the fighting. Finally, on January 10th, he quietly left the band. It wasn't anger, it was a firm decision. It was also the start of George becoming his own person. Before we continue their fallout, let's take a quick dive into George's spiritual journey. George Harrison's spiritual journey. In the 1960s, when the Beatles were super famous, George felt something was missing, and he didn't just want to be a star. He wanted to understand life. One day, he heard a sitar, a pretty-sounding Indian instrument, in a movie. That sound touched his heart, and he wanted to learn more despite being born into Christianity. So he met Ravi Shankar, a famous sitar player. Ravi didn't just teach him music, he taught him about peace, kindness, and looking inside yourself. George started reading special books from India and learning about karma, reincarnation, and finding out who you are. He wasn't like other rock stars. He didn't just want money or fame, he wanted to be calm and happy inside. He once said, "Every person wants to know the truth." That's what he was looking for, truth and peace. Not long after, he visited India searching for the truth. He didn't bring fancy clothes or bodyguards. He sat on the ground, prayed, and listened. In India, no one cared that he was a Beatle, and that's what George loved most. He let go of being famous and felt peaceful inside. That trip changed him. When he came back, he was quieter, kinder, and more thoughtful. In 1969, he made a song called My Sweet Lord. It's the one with Hallelujah and Hare Krishna in it. George said both words meant love for God, just in different languages. He believed all people, from all religions, were connected by love. Some people didn't understand. They thought he was acting strange. But George didn't mind. He once said, "If there's a God, we should try to find him." George turned his home in Henley-on-Thames into a peaceful place for his soul. It was like a temple. He filled it with sweet-smelling incense, quiet prayer rooms, and soft chanting. This wasn't a hobby for George. It was his real life. He even brought this into his music. Songs like "Within You, Without You" and "Long, Long, Long" weren't just songs. They were his prayers. While John Lennon spoke about politics and Paul McCartney focused on catchy tunes, George went deeper into his spiritual side. In 1971, he told Rolling Stone, "Everything else in life can wait, but the search for God cannot wait." Even after the Beatles ended, George stayed on his path. He gave money to temples, supported the Krishna movement, and meditated every day. Later in life, when he found out he had cancer, he stayed calm. He said, "Death is just where your suit falls off. It's not you." When he died, he was surrounded by friends and family, all chanting together. His faith gave him strength that fame never could. George once said, "I'm not this body. I'm just a soul with a guitar." And that soul only wanted peace now. We are diving back into his return to the band after his dramatic exit. The comeback after walking away. For 12 days, George Harrison walked away from the Beatles. This action shocked everyone. This wasn't just a little fight. It was more like a warning sign that the band might fall apart if care is not taken. But George didn't just sit around feeling sad after he left the Beatles. He went to visit Bob Dylan and the band, his friends in America. There, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace, laughter, and respect. They reminded him that music could be fun again, and that life outside the Beatles could be better. Still, George had grown up with the band. They were like brothers. So after some serious talks, he agreed to return, but only if they stopped arguing about doing live shows. He didn't want that anymore. The band agreed, moved filming to Apple Studios, and George came back. And when he did, something changed. George brought in two amazing songs, "Here Comes the Sun" and "Something." "Something" was so beautiful that Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Even John Lennon said it was the best song on Abbey Road. Fans agreed. It hit #1 in the US and topped charts worldwide. George became a star in his own right. In May 1970, something big happened. George's song "For You Blue" was released in the US alongside Paul McCartney's "The Long and Winding Road." Together, the songs reached #1 on the charts. It was a proud moment for George. But behind the scenes, he was carrying a heavy heart. George had written so many songs that were never used. While John and Paul filled up the albums, George only got 2 or 3 spots. He felt pushed aside, even when he had music that meant the world to him. That hurt built up slowly, and it helped push the Beatles to their breaking point. On January 4, 1970, George sat with Paul and Ringo to record the final touches on "Let It Be." They didn't know it then, but it would be George's last recording session as a Beatle. The band was falling apart. Power struggles, egos, and especially tension between George and Paul made everything harder. He was tired of being treated like a junior member. He fell in love with a woman the world adored. But he wasn't the only one. What happens when friendship, fame, and desire collide? You won't believe who broke whose heart. Personal life and relationships. George might have been the quiet one in the Beatles, but his love life was full of drama. It all started in 1964, on the set of A Hard Day's Night. George saw a young, pretty model named Patty Boyd playing the role of a schoolgirl. George didn't waste time. During lunch, he playfully turned to her and said, "Will you marry me?" Just like that. Patty laughed it off because she had a boyfriend, but George didn't give up. A few weeks later, they met again and started dating. By 1966, George and Patty tied the knot in a quiet wedding, with Paul McCartney as best man. At first, everything looked like a fairy tale, but behind closed doors, their marriage begins to face challenges. George started diving deep into meditation, traveling to India, and pulling away. Patty felt lonely, and his infidelity wasn't helping either. It got worse when he had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. Yeah, you heard right. That broke Patty's heart. She also said George changed after getting into substances. He became very cold and distant. They split in 1974 and finally divorced in 1977. However, George's close friend Eric was madly in love with Patty. He wrote her letters and even wrote Layla for her. Patty eventually married Eric in 1979. George didn't get mad, but he stayed friends with them and even went to their wedding, which was extremely weird. Eventually, George's real happy ending came in 1978, when he married Olivia Arias. She wasn't a model or a rock star, she worked at a record label. She was calm, smart, and loving, and helped George find peace. They had a son, Donnie, and stayed together until George passed away in 2001. Olivia stood by him through his darkest days and kept his memory alive afterward. Do you know how fame almost broke him? And what tragedy left a lasting mark on his heart? Stick around as we dive into the painful side of his stardom. The pain that came with fame. George's most terrifying moment came on December 30th, 1999. He and his wife, Olivia, were at home in their big mansion, Friar Park, when a man broke in with a knife. He ran straight at George and stabbed him several times. One stab missed his heart by just an inch. Olivia fought back with a lamp, saving George's life. He was left with a punctured lung and deep chest wounds. After that, he was never the same. His son Donnie later said the attack deeply hurt his soul. George never truly felt safe again. As if that trauma wasn't enough, cancer came knocking on George's door not once, but twice. In 1997, George was first diagnosed with throat cancer. He blamed it on years of smoking. He quietly got treatment and stayed out of the spotlight, hoping to heal. For a while, it looked like he had beaten it. But in 2001, doctors found the cancer had spread to his lungs and brain. George didn't panic. He stayed calm and spiritual, believing death was just another step. But for fans around the world, it was heartbreaking to watch him fade. The love-hate bond between George and Paul McCartney. The Beatles didn't just work together, they were like brothers. They laughed together, played music, and spent nearly every day side by side. Ringo Starr once said they were so close they'd hang out in hotel bathrooms just to be together. And George's ex-wife, Patty Boyd, even said they all belonged to each other. That's how deep their bond was. But even in the closest families, there can be arguments. And when it came to George and Paul, things got very tense over the years. Even though they first met as teenagers on the school bus, and Paul once called George his baby brother, their friendship didn't stay so sweet forever. At first, Paul and George loved learning guitar chords together. They shared a dream and helped build the Beatles. But soon, cracks began to show, especially when Paul started taking more control in the studio. When the Beatles made their famous album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, it was mostly Paul's idea. George felt left out. His songs weren't getting much attention. Most of the Beatles' albums had lots of songs by John and Paul, but George? Maybe one or two. He wanted his music to matter too. By 1969, George had had enough. During the recording of Abbey Road, George pushed back. He didn't want Paul changing his songs anymore. He told Paul directly that he wasn't just a quiet little brother anymore. He was an artist, too. In a private chat caught by writer Anthony Fawcett, Paul admitted something surprising to John Lennon. He said, "Until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now his songs are at least as good as ours." That sounds like a compliment, right? But George wasn't impressed. He answered, "That's a myth. Most of the songs I wrote this year, I wrote last year or the year before. Maybe now I just don't care whether you are going to like them or not. I just do them." George didn't want Paul's approval anymore. He just wanted the freedom to be himself. In a 1974 interview, George even said, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney." He further explained that Paul was a great musician but a bit overpowering at times. He added, "I would join a band with John Lennon any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney." And George wasn't just talking. He gave examples. He talked about Paul's song Maxwell's Silver Hammer. George said, "It was so fruity. After a while, we did a good job on it, but Paul got this idea in his head." George felt like Paul forced the band to work on songs they didn't believe in, just because he was bossy. Even after the Beatles broke up, these feelings didn't go away. In a 1974 BBC interview, George said something really strong. "McCartney ruined me as a guitar player." But even then, he also said, "There's always been something that's tied us together." That's the thing. George and Paul may have argued, but they were always connected by their shared history and love for music. However, years later, Paul admitted he may have underestimated George. In 2020, when asked by Howard Stern if he ever realized how good George's songs were, Paul replied, "It was easy to underestimate George because John and I had always written most of the stuff. But boy, did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever." In 1994, after John Lennon had passed away, George, Paul, and Ringo met again. People called them the Threetles. They worked on some of John's old demos together, but even then, George and Paul got on each other's nerves. They still clashed, just like old times. Towards the end of George's life, Paul visited him while he was being treated for cancer. They sat together and held hands, something Paul said they never did back in the day. Paul remembered, "It was good. It was like we were dreaming. He was my baby brother." The day after George died in 2001, Paul told reporters, "He was a lovely guy and a very brave man. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He is just my baby brother." No matter what happened between them, Paul's love for George was still strong. Additionally, their kids became close too. George's son Donnie and Paul's daughter Stella grew up with that Beatles legacy. Stella even designed Donnie's wife's wedding dress. At a gala in 2014, Donnie surprised Stella by performing "Live and Let Die," a powerful tribute that showed how much love still existed between their families. The quiet fight between George and John. At first, George admired John's sharp mind and respected his fearless songwriting. But over time, he grew tired of being treated like an outsider. John rarely took George seriously, especially when George started writing his songs and exploring Indian music and meditation. Instead of support, George got sarcasm. John once joked that George's spiritual talks were soft and boring. Meanwhile, people were busy talking about George and Paul not getting along, but little did they know there was a quiet fight between George and John, too. They were friends at first, but as the Beatles became famous, they grew apart. Even when George wrote famous songs like Something, John didn't say many nice things about them. Their friendship got cold, and after the Beatles ended, they hardly talked. He said John was too busy being John. In George's memoir, I, Me, Mine, he barely talked about John at all, which shows how far apart they had become. When John died, George felt sad, but he still remembered how hard things were between them. Underneath, George had some hurt feelings that never fully went away. So, it wasn't just Paul who was hard on George, it was John who hurt him inside the most. Between what was said and what was not, it's now clear to us that George truly hated him, and maybe the universe wasn't kind enough to give them a chance to sort out their differences. What do you do when your hero becomes your heartache? Did George's hurt push him toward greatness? Or was he simply trying to find peace in a world that never fully saw him? George Harrison's lasting legacy. After the Beatles broke up, George didn't run after the spotlight like Paul or John. Instead, he took a quieter path. In 1970, he released a giant triple album called All Things Must Pass. It was full of beautiful songs like My Sweet Lord and What's Life. People finally saw George not just as the quiet Beatle, but as a true star on his own. One of the most amazing things George did after the Beatles was the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. At the time, most rock stars didn't do charity shows, but he wanted to help. He saw people suffering from war and hunger in Bangladesh and knew he had to act. So he called up big names like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and even Ringo Starr to perform. The concert wasn't easy, and it was stressful to plan, and he had to deal with tricky schedules and big egos. But it worked. They raised millions of dollars, and George proved that music could truly help the world. Even after that, he stayed humble, and he quietly gave money to charities and spent his free time meditating or gardening. Friends said he would leave parties just to be alone with his thoughts. Today, George's legacy is still alive. Musicians say he inspired them, not just with his guitar, but with his heart. George wasn't loud, but he made a big impact. He showed the world that kindness, faith, and music can change everything. What do you think of George and John's fallout? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.